4, 3, 2.
Welcome, everyone, to Alaska Quarterly Review's Reading and Conversation Series, Piezas de Resistance. I am Ronald Spatz, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review. And I am so pleased you could join us today for this event, which is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel, youtube.com, Alaska Quarterly Review. So you can tell your friends about it and they can watch it later. And there are many, many other events, amazing ones, on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to watch any of our programs and share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. Like all literary magazines, AQR depends on grants, tax-exempt donations, and subscriptions to operate. If so inclined, donations and subscriptions are gratefully welcomed on the AQR website, aqreview.org. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgements. Alaska Quarterly Review acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support. And finally, for the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 organization, which makes this event possible. We also thank the 49 Writers Organization for including our events in their newsletter. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. Alaska Quarterly Review is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is the Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional present and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples and marks our collective movement towards equity. Today, we have three wonderful poets that I'm going to introduce in order, and then they will begin without interruption in terms of additional introductions. So we have Kirun Kapur, DM Aderibigbe, DM Aderibigbe, and Lena, Khalaf, Tuffaha. And we're going to have, like I said, them read in order. Now for the introductions. Kirun's latest book, Women in the Waiting Room, was a finalist for the National Poetry Series and published by Black Lawrence Press in 2020. It was included in the Best Books of 2020 by Kirkus Reviews. She's the winner of the Arts and Letters Rumi Prize and the Antivenom Poetry Award for her first book, Visiting Indira Gandhi's Palmist, Elixir Press, 2015. Her work appears in many magazines, including Alaska Quarterly, AGNI, Poetry International, Prairie Schooner, Ploughshares, many other journals. She has been the recipient of an Arts and Letters Rumi Prize in Poetry, a Best of the Net Award, a Nazim Hikmet Prize, and the Callaloo Award. In 2015, NBC News named her to their list of Asian American poets to watch. Kirun grew up in Hawaii and has since lived and worked in North America and South Asia. Her first job was as a writer for India's groundbreaking feminist magazine, Manushi, and from there, her travels took her through Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. She has taught creative writing at Boston University, Brandeis University, and has been granted fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Vermont Studio Center, and MacDowell Colony. Kirun serves as editor of the Beloit Poetry Journal and teaches at Amherst College, where she is director of the program in creative writing there. DM Aderibigbe is a native of Nigeria. His debut book of poems, How the End First Showed, University of Wisconsin Press, 2018, won the Brittingham Poetry Prize, among other honors. His poems appear in Alaska Quarterly, Callaloo, Jubilat, The Nation, and elsewhere. He is an assistant professor in the Center for Writers at the University of Southern Mississippi and a doctoral PhD candidate in English at Florida State University. In addition to the Brittingham Prize in Poetry, he has also won a Florida Book Award in Poetry and several fellowships from the James Merrill House, Banff Center for the Arts, UCross Foundation, Sewanee's Writers Conference at the University of the South, OMI International Arts Center, Jantel Foundation, and Boston University. DM has said this of his work: I am a poet who writes in a language that isn't his own, a poet who writes about events in Yoruba households, about events in Lagos food canteens, markets, and streets. I am a poet who infuses a considerable amount of his native Yoruba into his poetry. Lena, Khalaf, Tuffaha. Lena, Khalaf, Tuffaha is a poet, essayist, and translator. Her first book of poems, Water and Salt, won the 2018 Washington State Book Award. She is also the author of 2 chapbooks, Arab in Newsland, winner of the 2016 Two Sylvias Prize, and Letters from the Interior, finalist for the 2020 Jean Pedrick Chapbook Award. Her essays have been published in the Seattle Times, Elaram Weekly, and Kenyon Review Online. She translated the screenplay for a multi-award-winning feature film, When I Saw You, written and directed by Anna Marie Jassir, and Lena translated I Am a Guest on This Earth by Iraqi poet Faiza Sultan, published by Dar Safi Press. Lena's poems have been published in print and in online journals, including Alaska Quarterly Review, Magnolia, Blackbird, Bower Street, the Taos Journal of International Poetry, and Art, Diode, Floating Bridge Review, Texas Review, and others. Several of her poems have been anthologized. Running Orders was published in Letters to Palestine, American Writers Respond to War and Occupation by Verso Press. Seafaring Nocturne, published in Gaza, Gaza Unsilenced by Just Word Books, messed up the title there, Gaza Unsilenced by Just Word Books. Altered States, published in Bettering American Poetry, Volume 2. Fragment, published by Making Mirrors, Writing by Refugees by Olive Branch Press. Immigrant, published by Ink Knows No Borders by Triangular Square Press, and Elegy, published in the Beat Break Poets, Volume 3, Halal If You Hear Me by Haymarket Books. Oliver de la Paz wrote, in the music of Tuffaha's poetry, there is a clear summons, beckoning us to join in the feast of her language. These are poems that rise, surge, and stir us. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kirun, and we will begin.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with DM and Lena and to be in conversation with the Alaska Quarterly Review, a magazine that has remained a favorite of mine for a long time. I'm going to read primarily from Women in the Waiting Room tonight. And I'll start with a first poem that's first in the sense that it's both the beginning of the book and in the sense that it talks about a first story, a foundational story. This poem thinks about the great Hindu epic poem, the Ramayana. which is not just about its namesake, Lord Ram, but as many of you know, I'm sure, it's also about his wife, Sita, who in the course of the story is carried away by a demon. On looking at myself in the mirror, or rereading Valmiki's Ramayana, anyone can disappear across the black water. Every girl can be taught. Her middle name is shame. When will I burn the urge for purity? My bones are a furnace. My face is a game. Every girl steals away with a demon at some point. All her alphabets, ankle bells, all her braids. She will meet herself in the third person. She will lie with her fear. She will dress in her rage. The world is curdled with husbands, blue as the gods and gentle as flame. Hotline. I have been trained. So when she says, I watched my father smash my mother's forehead with a wooden broom handle, I show no sign of shock. The poet liked to say, you shouldn't borrow sorrow, write real things, dishpans, porch screens, broom handles. Give me a humble trash bag. For years, this face I trained my mind to unsee. Cheek eaten away by fish, girl body washed up in the canal, wrapped, the brand identified as glad. No scars, birthmarks, clothes, jewelry. 5'2", 133, precisely my own height and weight. Police were saying, was she sure it was a broom handle, metal or wooden? We need the details right. How could a wooden handle do all that? The poet suggests, make it a skillet. I'd believe he killed her with a skillet, if you must. On the page, I describe lilies wilting in a vase because I have been trained, because you have been trained. Can you believe? 6 glistening stamens, smashed rust velvet anthers. That's a poem that found its home in Alaska Quarterly, actually. Waiting for sleep, I imagine Sita in her youth. She hid all day in a tree, ate guavas rubbed with salt and pepper, stalked the long-haired cat, begged for rotis, ghee, and sugar, watched as her mother dressed, bangles stacking her arms like gauntlets. From the window, she could see women from every corner of the city walk into the river, disappear, then rise clean, saris soaking. She drank milk from a hammered brass cup. Around her, aunts, cousins unrolled their sleeping mats. Of course, a woman oiled her hair. Of course, a woman lined her eyes. The inner world was made of women. They filled her stomach, mouth, breath. What do I need to see embroidered in my mind's own dark? This girl, young enough to fall asleep. This dream taking her into its current, so we might both rise ready to ring out the story. I've been thinking a lot about the way we face things we can't change. Maybe this is just a time of dread and worry, and thinking about sort of how we confront that was behind this next poem. I ride upon a tiger. My bones are made of whales, and when whales die, their songs. My eyes are pits of mangoes, scraped clean by teeth. From my feet plunge 50 streams. The rush, the cold, exposes underworlds of fear. 4 stomachs cannot explain my hungers. I have devoured myself. I have tread upon my loves. Strung with a necklace of hummingbirds, my hair in braids, my braids are tongues. Atop my head, a crown of 40 languages, all spoken at once. My breastplates gleam and thrum, 2 armies marching on. You who extract the marrow and the light, you who suck the sun and leave the bone eroded colder. Demon, disease, dear fated one, do you hear? I will come to you on the back of a tiger. We'll finish with one more from the end of the book. A few years ago, I moved to a town that has 2 rivers that run through it. And although I grew up with lots of water, surrounded by water, there were not rivers really where I grew up. So I find myself fascinated by the river all the time. Let me be as a river. Nothing but motion, muck-mouthed, mud-hearted, brackish, all dirty at the lip, with rise and fall that exposes, hull-gouging stones. No curiosity about source, no knowledge of destination, just willingness to bear anything right to the end. 1 hour wrinkled, 2 hours smooth, silver as fish skin, duck-fouled, trash-choked, silent, then gossiping under a full red moon. Let me be dredged when the leggy girls go missing, used for a slow cruise, churned for speed, reeking of the unseen ocean, veiled in the scent of pine trees, a fog in the head, then clear as the tip of a pin, enough beauty to draw blood, enough anger to strip the banks, enough fullness to carry the pleasure boats high. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really powerful. Now you're on, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, Kirun, thank you so much for that. It's such an honor to share this space with Kirun and Lena. And thank you, Ron, Alaska Quarterly Review and Courage Museum for putting this together. So I'll be reading primarily from my first book, How the End First Showed. So the poems in this book are kind of like the stories here belong to my grandmother, my mother, and all African women. So that's what I will say about that. So I'll just read the first poem, Olumo's Face, which appeared in the Alaska Quarterly Review. Walking across a bamboo bridge spread on a marsh which tore Abeokuta into 2 halves. A hoe clipped to a shoulder, a peg to a cloth on a line. Shadows of Olumo rock fluttering beneath the limbs of insects, perched on the face of the unholy water. The hair stopped moving, but the water fluttered. My grandmother's eyes walked on the water. On the end of the bridge, a man pressed a woman's head into the water because of a dead womb. When did a woman's failure lift her to the throne of God or the seat of Darwin to give reasons for life? The man pressed and pressed her face into the water. My grandmother, just 9, cried and cried before the woman became a ghost. So I will read a couple more poems from the next section of the book, Yeah, pretty self-explanatory. Hungry Man. And this, as most of these poems, they have a lot of Yoruba in them, so I code switch a lot because using Yoruba is kind of like, just holding on to like my, my people and, just bringing them along because English is not our first language. So a lot of these poems have the Yoruba in them. Hungry Man. Àbúrò mi ọ̀wọ́n. This was how the day unfolded from your mouth. Mama mi, ebi ń pa mí. Mother peeled and slashed a tube of yam to feed 3 sets of teeth. Blue sun, hashed from a matchstick, burned beneath mother's ceramic pot. We salivated, slices of yam softened. We chewed our teeth, slices of yam perished. Mother smiled. Father arrived, filled the room with curses. His voice beats in our heart as thunder on the walls of a building. His empty stomach was a bowl of anger. In a room built without silence, Father was eating Mother. So this is titled Tiredness. Vehicles hoot and honk. The deadlocked traffic jam sputter smoke into the afternoon. Curses and pleas sprayed on the road like pollution. Afternoon gathers around the downfall bus. 2 men struggle to pull open the door. A man pours his folded fist on a woman like stones. I stand outside the bus, looking. My father slaps and slaps my mother with the back of his hands. My mother's lips are broken. 2 men hold up my father's hands, his knuckles painted with blood. Mother lies on the ground, tired of rising after every fall. I'll read one more poem from here and then read a couple of new poems. On the 5th day, in praise of our absent father. On the 5th day of a month, made of harmattan and cold sun, Mother washed dirt off grains of rice. She chopped carrots, onions, pepper, and liver on a slab into rings. My older sister slit open the belly of a huge ejacote, packed out its intestine as one offloads clothes from a bag. Needs of sweat slipped down their faces. The sitting room, strands of juju melody streamed out of the stereo. The house was covered with music. From the kitchen, Mother's effort smelled delicious. My mother wore ashoke. She danced, we ate, raising cups in praise of her loneliness. So I'll read 2 new poems, and like the first is written in Pidgin, and so I've been working on a collection that just deals with colonialism and things like that. So this is from the point of view of one of the kings who accepted, he converted to Christianity, and then after the British ransacked his town, he converted back. So this is based on a letter he wrote to like his fellow kings, and it's titled Light After Light. My people, the day where I come turn born again, I put fire for all the place where people been they throw bosa to all them gods. I swear, say I go sink all them gods. I call my boys, make them go throw them for water before the day waka. I come call all the way come for after Sabbath. I come talk say anybody wey no gree follow this new way, him go hear am from my hand. Every Sunday, my front yard dey turn garage where people full. We go sing, praise, from me, the king, to my smallest may God. Pray, from my smallest may God to me, the king. Now so this evening, Oyinbo men enter my bunk. Dem pack, me and my people don learn o. Make una thank you. So the last poem that I would read is a ghazal, and just basically titled Class, revolves around the politics of language, English, and how most people of my generation, how we were kind of like raised with Yoruba, but we aspire to English because it's seen as the language of English. Being able to speak English reflects smartness. I mean, which is definitely not true, but that's how it is now, which is kind of like a result of colonialism itself. There are 8 people in my family. Only one speaks English. I was born with Yoruba. At 13, I came to English. Before my tongue's baptism, I was tied to silence. Had learned the stupid speak Yoruba, the smart English. Once, a boy from my new school denied his mother to me because she knew no word in English. Mother bought me a dictionary the day I came home to hide an old raggedy textbook called New Practical English. On her proud days, I was the dictionary on which she relied. DM, a name I found after my mother's death through English. Thank you.
Wow, so powerful. Okay, Lena.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Ron and everyone at Alaska Quarterly and at the museum for hosting us this evening. It's a great privilege to be reading with DM and with Kirun. I just really deeply enjoyed hearing your poems in your voices. I think I'll start today with a poem that was published in AQR. It now lives in my chapbook, Letters from the Interior. This is a book in which there are several Dear Miss Sahad poems. These are poems written to an Arabic teacher by her student, fictional Arabic teacher. Dear Miss Sahad, unsent. I'm writing long after any words can reach you. My greatest fault continues to be my adamant belief in this world, this man-made project of coins and clay, because coins tarnish and clay must ultimately crumble. Religion keeps trying to save me from my misplaced devotion, to show me that where you now live offers a biosphere of mercy, lushness, shade, the end of drought, a better investment of time and prayers. I would like to give up praying. I understand at a cellular level the absurdity of asking for divine intervention, a foreign solution to a civil war. I understand, and yet I am writing because it is all I know, that and remembering. Do you remember the conversations we had in your garden? Do you remember a walk under the pistachio branches when you explained that borders aren't just ink printed on maps, and I asked if we could draw new ones, and you warned me against the sultry cry of such a rough beast? These are the questions that must never be asked in a poem. And so another poem from this collection, it's actually the last poem in the chapbook, also continues to evoke Miss Sahad, the Arabic teacher, and it also makes a reference to a past tense verb, asbaha. There are several poems in this chapbook that are in conversation with the sisterhood of Arabic past tense verbs. Morning lantern. Miss Sahad had spoken of this sister, asbaha, morning verb. And as she spoke, a sun had risen over her words. It was the most arduous lesson, one that required a tearing apart at the seams, a loosening of crimson thread, cross-stitch in 7-branch cedars and rows of eglantine. To have become, more than the desolate stretches of perseverance, more than the eternally flowering fields of Cannes. To have become, full fathoms of night traversed, and then a light upon the corrugated metal and slumped rooftops of the camp, gilding the limestone of what was, or bluing it from sight entirely. To have become, to pass from one form into another, chrysalis dwellers finally cutting the wind with our own wings. Asbaha, sister of the earliest hours, from the edge of sky, a call to the smallest prayer, and the sunbirds chorusing, their feathers flashing sapphire, emerald, and Feiruz on the radio, her longing and the day's headlines dissolved in our coffee cups. To have become, to sunder a sorrow from our bodies and rise to soft, unburned wicks, to live. A lot of the poems I write revisit the refugee experience. I'm Palestinian American, and the Palestinian story is one that is a story of refugees who are still resisting and waiting for their chance to go home, to return to their homelands. And so that story and the way in which it opens up my heart to the refugee experience of neighbors and fellow human beings is a big theme in my work. So this poem is entitled Time Management, and it's from my first collection, my full-length Water and Salt. Time management. What if you knew that it could all be taken away? In the thin light of morning, between the dawn prayer call and the full glow of day, it could all go. A tsunami years in the making arrives at the shore of your life, swallows the wrought iron and stone of your world. What if you knew when your feet shuffled in slippers to the bathroom that morning that you would never shave again at that mirror, never pat your chin dry with the blue towel or ignore the crescendo of birdsong in the lemon branches beyond the window? Would you touch the walls in farewell one last time as you ran for your life? Would you linger over the tea, fill your lungs up with the fragrance of mint floating in your cup? Would you take things with you, impractical things that are difficult to carry because you'll spend forever wanting them? If you knew that on the other side of the century, your grandchildren would only be able to walk by your house, only look at the paint peeling off shutters from the street renamed, would you run? Would you save your life? If you knew you'd die waiting, would you choose the long march into oblivion or the headlong dive? And I was going to read a newer poem to close, but I think I'm going to do a very Palestinian thing, which is to sort of gather our spirit and sort of steel us for what is ahead, because those of us who are resisting colonialism and violence in our daily lives, and those of us who support from exile and diaspora the resistance of our people, can only spend so much time lingering in sorrow and have to really sort of gather our spirits and remain strong. And the title poem from this book, Water and Salt, for me was my very, very humble attempt to kind of echo that phenomenal, awe-inspiring resistance that I admire so much in my people. Water and Salt, the title comes from a prisoner strike. Political prisoners across Palestine in the year 2014 went on a hunger strike to resist their unjust imprisonment. And they subsisted on only water and salt. So this poem is in their honor. Behind the walls of your jails we wait, heartbeats audible now, muffled thuds above the current of blood running thin, indigo rivulets pulsing loud beneath parchment skin, chafing and coarse like stone walls that surround us. We lie side to side. We hunger for what eating cannot feed. We carve out a sanctuary that no beating can tear down. No interrogation room scars can pierce. This is our ache. We decide how we live and if we die. We decide who gives and who takes away. We claim the freedom to turn stone into sunlight streaming through your jails, to sip water and salt like sacrament. Freedom to own our bodies and the land beneath them. To breathe the air on both sides of the wall. Freedom to wait and wait for your checkpoints and your watchtowers to be subsumed in a crashing wave of water and salt. You never saw it coming, this cleansing, how we have become this ocean. Thank you.
Well, so powerful. So now I think we're going to get back to a gallery view, maybe, Cody. But okay, so I don't know if we are or not. Are we back in a gallery view?
We are, yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for those amazing readings. I get kind of nervous, so I got a little tangled up on the names, but didn't get nervous when I accepted your poems. And you read, some of the ones that we picked, and they deal with hard issues from your lens. They're unfiltered and they represent a version of truth, an important one. So I'm going to frame two questions that I think in the limited time we have left, I'd just like to go through those two. And I'll frame it with this. You all are inspired by experience of crossing cultural borders, geographic borders, borders between languages, borders between cultures, borders between the present and the past. And within those borders, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of pain. I have two ways that I want to talk about it. We'll go to the micro about how you write, to the more macro in terms of the impact that it might have on the viewers. So the first part is about translation. DM is writing in three languages, basically, in his mind. He has three different ways that he can write, and he's living here. Lena has two, plus she's fluent in a third, but not to speak it, I guess, academically. So she almost has three. Kirun also is dealing with cultures. And sometimes translation is not only in the language, it's understanding the nuances of culture. It's understanding how to get under the skin and into the community so other people can understand it. So what I wonder is, when you're thinking about these borders, these languages, when you're writing, I have just a couple of questions about translating. Does anything get lost in translation? When you're trying to do this, how do you deal with that? How do you try to bridge, let's say, maybe the inadequacy of language, which is hard enough when you don't have to do all this extra, right? And then the second thing is there something in particular that you find, and if you have any examples in your work that we could go real quickly, where you're addressing these problems and maybe talking about maybe a difference if you're going from particularly one that you consider your home language to another, or a home culture to another, versus when you're going from another back into the language that you feel most comfortable with. So I'll throw it out to anybody who wants to address that, and you can bring up any of the work, or if you have a poem or part of one that you have in front of you that you would want to refer to, a moment in it, or something that would illustrate a potential issue that you wrestle with.
Well, maybe I'll jump in on the first part of what you asked about how you deal with what's lost in translation. I think, there is certainly no way to bring things across exactly. But I often think of translation as a sort of sensation where the original lives inside this box, and each translation is like a little window, a little hole that you can peer through inside. And through that translation, you see one view of that original. And it's not the total of it, but it is this amazing window that opens for you through that one translation. And in that sense, the translator's job isn't to bring across everything, right? The translator's job is to create one window through which that original mystery can be experienced and perceived, and that the original in that sense gets to preserve its mystery, which is something that I find a more powerful way, a more exciting way to think of translation than to think of it in terms of what's lost. The other part I would just say about sort of losing and finding, is that it's interesting that we focus so much on what's lost. And, it comes back to maybe, certainly in the West, the sense that from the Bible, we get the story of Babel, right? That we all speak different languages is a punishment. But in that sense, translation becomes this wonderful act of resistance, right? Where you can say that no matter what culture separates us, no matter how many centuries separate us, even if God separates us, right, we can speak to each other, imperfectly maybe, partially maybe, but we can reach across through translation and find each other.
I really love that image of the box, Kirun, with the different sort of little points of light where you're looking and seeing some version of the whole. I just find that really perfect for my experience of translation. Right now, I'm actually working on a translation of a novella, which is new for me. I've only really focused on poetry for the most part in the past, the exception of the screenplay. And it's a novella by a Palestinian poet and novelist, Maya Abul Hayat. And one of the things that has been so refreshing in this experience is how many different versions of myself I get to discover, right? Because I'm carrying it over from the Arabic into the English. And so the first take, I feel very much like an Arabic speaker, an Arab, like dutifully carrying it over in like super accurate English. And then, the next iteration, there's a part of my brain that's maybe somewhere between those two cultures that's, kind of refining. And then there's a very editorial, like deeply American version of me and so apparently there's like a whole host of people in there. And, we normally introduce ourselves in these narrow terms, but it made me reflect on how she is also a complex person, this writer, with all different sort of iterations and versions of her identity. And so in that way, translation is an invitation to really broaden how we think of one another and ourselves, I think, beyond kind of the narrow confines of prescribed identity.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that, Lena. I mean, I'm not like I haven't done a lot of translation. And so, hearing you guys and other things I've learned, I think it's very good, because for me personally, as I mentioned earlier on before the show started, translation goes beyond language for me. I think about, translating experience. And now, when Ron mentioned what's lost, and, sometimes I think about how, as someone coming from this part of the world where, especially poetry is not as widely accepted in America, so to say, and our sensibilities. I think about how, to translate this experience, at least for me and, for my people, and to my own satisfaction. But it's pretty difficult because of how, provincial American literature is, and how, things are approached. So for me, translation is all about experience and how I'm able to translate what I'm thinking about in my first language, Yoruba, or what I'm thinking about in my second language, Pidgin, and how I, think about this. Because when I think creatively, I think about these things in Yoruba and English and Pidgin, sorry, but I write it down in English. So this first process of translation for me, I'm translating my ideas and my, my thinking. So that's how translation works for me. And, in terms of what's lost, yeah, some things are lost because there are like no direct English words for some of the things we have in Yoruba and some of the things that we have in Pidgin. So, sometimes, yeah, it definitely gets lost there. I mean, thank you.
Well, let me, if I could follow up a little bit with the idea, you wanted to go to the positive side, which is a good thing, but I'm still concerned because what I've learned in the 40 plus years up in Alaska, I've looked what's happened with the indigenous cultures here. When in fact, people who did not understand the culture, even if they were well-intentioned and thought they understood it, would do the translations. And that actually became the story because it wasn't done with either the knowledge or the cultural sensitivity. I wondered if you could, respond to that. I mean, because it really doesn't matter who is doing the translating. And what their lens is, as well as what their ability is, because I've seen it firsthand, what the damage it did to the stories of, say, Alaska Native people when things were mistranslated. And then even again, mistranslated. In other words, the original thing that supposedly was the original text was not at all original, right? It was just the first thing that somebody put into English. And then it got even further away from it, almost like a game of telephone. So I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, because I think translation is not only an art, as does the National Endowment for the Arts. So in other words, if you're translating poetry, or prose, you're doing art. I mean, so now you even have to do something else. You're not going just A to B, then you have to get all those beautiful nuances of culture. So I just wondered, just to make it harder, what do you do to ensure, particularly if it's not your home language, to make sure that there isn't that kind of mistake made? And I'll just add one other thing. Misunderstandings between people. You talked about how babble and everybody can talk to each other. Well, how many fights are because how somebody takes a word? A word has so much meaning to them. And the other person is not sensitive to the meaning of that word. And boom. So, I mean, since all of you write without any filter, you're brave and courageous, which is, you're really dealing with things. This has to be a serious concern, right? When you're doing anything to do with, we'll even say translating experience, as opposed to even just translating the literal words.
I mean, it's an interesting issue that you raised, Ron. The way I'm hearing what you're raising is a question about power. And I think that that's a really important dynamic in translation. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that each of us is translating a language that is our own, from one, like, I don't think any of us are approaching a language we don't actually speak or live in to some degree. And so when you bring up the story of the native cultures that have been misrepresented, the thing that it raises in my mind is who was doing those translations and what were they doing it for? And so there's a kind of maybe like a cultural tourism approach that maybe was, I'm hoping is less pervasive now than perhaps in times in the past, but we know now, that that's a kind of violence. and
Absolutely.
fact even of culture. And so, yeah, I can't imagine, I can't imagine the harm that must cause, not addressing that power dynamic.
Do you all feel the same? I mean, do you feel totally comfortable with translating the different levels of experience between things?
Yeah, for me, definitely. I mean, the poem I read, written in Pidgin, I also, have it in English sonnets, and I, why translating it back to Pidgin, because I wrote it in Pidgin first, and then, translated it to English and then back to Pidgin, some words in that, like, you can't just find some English words in Pidgin, and I just feel comfortable, having like the words that I think are like closest, in terms of like what I'm trying to pass across, because I feel like, the experience that I'm trying to translate is still the same thing, or it's kind of approximate to, what I have in English. And since I know both language, and since it's kind of the story I'm telling is sort of like, my country's story, I feel confident about that. So in terms of that, I think, yeah.
Kirun?
Well, I would say I feel I feel uncomfortable with all writing and worry about how well I'm approaching what I intend to say or should say, even in English or in anything. I think writing is just hard, and you always have to be thinking about power and the way that your words represent you and your experience and others and those who hear what you're saying. So I certainly think that that's an important thing to think about. In terms of translation, I would say, there are lots of translators who work and translate from languages they don't speak themselves. And I think, in those situations, the best thing is to be humble, right? And to know that you're bringing one piece of the puzzle to that process. And that for the other pieces, you need to seek out others, right? So you might work with a scholar of that language or a native speaker of that language, or several scholars and native speakers of that language. And, in the mix between all of you, you'll come to a translation which will not be the perfect translation, right? Some other translator and some other groups of people will come up with a slightly different one. I think my hope is always that when I work on a piece of translation, that I will not be the only person to translate it. And that others will come after me, and they will open a different window to that original. And that I have to remember that no matter, even if it's a language I know really well or a language I don't know really well, I will not be bringing its full glory across, its full mystery across. I don't think that we can do that in translation. Maybe we can't even do that in our own poems. I don't know. I think starting from a place of deep humility and asking and seeking and looking to undo those imbalances of power where we find them is the approach I try to take.
That makes sense. And this goes to the idea of translating experience as opposed to the words, which you do in your poems. That's exactly what you're doing. And as we know, poetry has tremendous power, and the arts are incredibly underrated for how important they are. And so I started with the idea of crossing all these borders of all the different kinds. And now, I think one of the powers of arts, all arts, but very, very important in the literary arts, is the idea of creating empathy and compassion. It's creating empathy and compassion through truth. And truth is messy, and truth is different from the different angles of people seeing it. It's not always this, same thing, same event, different truth depending on the angle that you're looking at it. So, I'd like to end on this because all three of you are really courageous writers, poets, and I admire you, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to come on. I want to ask you how you seek to build empathy when you are addressing, and actually you are addressing diverse cultures, even if you speak the language, because, you know, there are nuances of things even within. I'm not saying, Lena, that, yeah, I'm not commenting on that specifically, but I think even within groups, there are divisions. And so how do you seek to build empathy across diverse cultures and experiences? How do you seek to, you know, Kirun, we took a very, very powerful poem of yours, right? And put it in. It's not easy to listen to. It's impossible to ignore, however, as what people do. You put us there and you made us look at it. It's a kind of way that you can experience something and be in shoes. On the other hand, we need to, in an increasingly polarized world, where things are, I mean, it's getting worse and worse everywhere, almost on every level. And so in my mind, the arts are in some ways the only hope. They are the only hope, because if we talk to each other, like you said, everybody can communicate. What kind of talk is the talk that's going to actually bridge these gaps and go to the heart, right? And you can think right away, well, music does that. Visual art does that. Dance does that. And of course, poetry and prose do that when they are in the artistic context. So how do you do it? What's your take on it? We only have a minute or so, but it is something that I think for courageous writers, it's something that I know it's something you'd want to do. I mean, I think that's where you change people. I mean, as literature teachers and creative writing teachers, you know, when people read something that's really powerful and they're in the shoes, it changes their world. They go, oh, now I know what that feels like, right? I mean, so just dive in and then we'll conclude, you know, nothing fluff with our end conversation, all hard stuff. Whoever wants to start, and then just go as you see. None of you want to start? How you aim for empathy? Have you given up on empathy and compassion? You haven't, right? It's just a hard question, isn't it? Well, Michael, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, personally, I just hope that I create like when I write poems, and when I write my poems are populated with people, real people. I just hope that I'm able to write about and create a character that I'm able to humanize my characters in a way that like other people will be able to see them as human beings, just not caricatures, and be able to relate to their experiences and things like that. I mean, you've said it, or literature helps us to kind of step into, good literature helps us to step into the mind of another human being, right? So which if that's what I hope to be able to achieve by just write my poems and create humanize my characters, as I mentioned. And I just hope that the reader would also be open to this and be willing, right, to step into this the mind of this these characters, or this human being, this poet who is creating these poems. So yeah, that's the best I can just say. Yeah.
Lena or Kirun, do you want to add anything to that? You just muted yourself. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, sorry. I don't know if I've given up on empathy. It's hard now. I tend to agree with your assessment of how the world looks. The poets I return to for comfort are ones that just say the thing as it is, and the poetic sort of majesty of their work is in its directness and in its unsparing honesty. So when times are really rough, I turn to poets like June Jordan. and I don't know a poet who's more direct in her magnificent address. I feel like when I'm reading, like she's looking me right in my eyes. And so I hold that as a goal for myself. I think I'm not a fan of the American notion of both sides and different. I kind of don't like, I feel like, the goal is to try to be as honest as humanly possible. There's nothing more poetic than that. And on the rare occasion that I feel like I've made a good attempt, I feel like those poems are the ones that have found their readers. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
Well, that makes sense, what you just said. Kirun?
It's a hard question to answer. I think when I talk to my students about writing, what I often end up saying to them is, what are the bodies doing? What are the bodies doing in the poem? And, I think less about trying to create empathy than trying to tell what it's like from the inside of the body, I think. And from there, I think other people can enter. We all have bodies, right? The mystery of our existence is that we are all incarnate here. That is something that we share and something that we can enter into immediately, and is what makes the poem alive and embodied and places the reader inside the poem, no matter how far their personal experience might be from the subject of the poem. So I think I try to make that question of empathy very granular, and it comes down to right, what are the hands doing and how do they feel, right? What is the light like against the face, and find that empathy, if it's going to arise in a poem, it starts there, sort of, rather than from a larger or more abstract question that I might have.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. And I wasn't suggesting that it has to be external or that you think about it, but ultimately that's when it's working, when it ultimately has its power, that's what it does. It has to be authentic. And I agree with you, Lena, there are some things that don't have two sides. So, Charlottesville in the US, that did not have two sides, in my opinion. There were no two sides to that. It was very clear that that was one side. But sometimes there are multiple sides to a kind of truth. It's very messy. And somehow, if the arts could get inside of those people of goodwill, by the way, not everybody has goodwill, right? But people of goodwill, if you could be inside and show the empathy, make it real. What's the body doing? As you just said, might get to a better place. Well, anyway, okay. I really am grateful to you. Got a little nervous at the beginning. I'm sorry with the names, got a little jumbled up. So when I get nervous, I focus on the things that make me nervous and then I mess them up. That's just pretty obvious, right? But very proud to have you in our journal, Alaska Quarterly. It takes pride in having real writing and not being afraid of writers who are taking a risk or who from their lens are bearing witness from their perspective with honesty and integrity. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with telling the audience what we have coming up also in February. We have 2 more events. Next Wednesday, we have a craft event, which is very special insofar as we generally don't do those. And it is called Facts into Poems, a craft conversation between Jane Hirschfield and Dorianne Locks. Dorianne and Jane are both contributing editors to Alaska Quarterly. And it turned out they both, and this was unbeknownst to them or to me, wrote poems about the same event. I published one of them, had the other one, it's going to publish that. We published 2 things from the exact factual thing. And so I raised the issue about, wow, how did that happen? I mean, the exact factual news report. So that's this coming Wednesday, February 16th, 3 p.m. Alaska time, 7 p.m. Eastern. And it'll also be recorded and on our YouTube channel. And on Friday, back to our normal Fridays for our reading series, the 25th, we have Pete Duval, Renee Branham, and Charlie Brook reading their fiction. So with that, I want to thank everybody again, the Alaska Museum, Cody Carver at the museum, and our Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, our 501c3. Thank you very much, and hope to see everybody on Wednesday.